For this demo, I want to work a little bit more with divs and talk just a little bit more about using divs, positioning divs, using different measurements when controlling divs, and then also getting a little bit into like padding and margin, and a couple of other settings that impact like how we can work with them, work with divs as we're trying to add more content in. Okay, so for starters, I'm going to make my week 4 HTML page. So I've got my folder open here. I need to make a week 4 folder. And then add index.html, same as we have been doing. I'm then going to go into my week 1 HTML again, copy that. Week 4, paste there, because that's like our most simple one. I'm going to change this to week 4. And then we'll say something like week 4 was pretty exciting! Exclamation point. Okay, then while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to go to my homepage and add my week 4 link just so that it's there. And then we'll say, this week I worked on some new live performance materials. Something like that, some sort of description of whatever it was you worked on. Okay, so in week 4, let's start by adding a few divs. And I'm going to give these a class of grid item. This is a class that I use a lot for, just assigning like what the grid item is going to be. This is what I'm going to build the grid out of. And so I'll make 3 of these, and I'll put my week 4 was very exciting in the first one. You can see all these things are starting to form over here. Okay, so the class is grid item. I'm going to copy that and go to my main.css. I'm going to go to the bottom. I'm going to hit return a few times. Now, I like to keep my CSS files arranged in in a way that stays connected to what I'm adding to my pages. So you'll notice at the top, I keep the default HTML things here, body A for the links, H1 for the headers. And then when I start defining stuff like classes, and in a little bit, we'll get into an ID, which is just a different selector that you can use in CSS for divs and other items. I start putting these below. And I also try to arrange them based on, in a lot of ways, like the hierarchy on the page in terms of like, in my HTML top to bottom. So this is a class called grid item. It's over here, and so I can see it. Why don't I assign it a background color? Again, this is like one of the things I do like early in the process. So I'll make it a light gray. And when I hit save, why didn't it come up? So I'm here. I've linked my style sheet. I have my style sheet. Oh, I think it's just too dark to see on my screen. There we go. Okay. So take 2. Make the color light enough that it shows up. All right. Okay, so now we have a light background color there, but you'll notice only one of the divs is showing up. I've got 3 in my document. However, these other 3 don't have anything in them. So in order to be able to see them, let's give all of them a height. We'll just force them to have a height for now. So we'll say each one is 200 pixels. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but there's like a thin line there that's showing me like, okay, the div is automatically 100% the width. That's just how divs work. They're stacking on top of each other. And then now we're forcing them to be 200 pixels tall, but I still kind of can't see it great. So I can add a border around each div. And the way the border works is there's 3 parameters. There's the thickness of the border. There's the type of border it is, whether it's solid or dotted. And then there's the color. So I'm just going to real simply do a 1 pixel border. Say it's solid. And then for the color, I will pick green so I can see it. So now I can see my boxes. I could even increase this border if I want to, make it like 4 pixels so I can see it really well. And this is what's really nice about brackets is as I'm making the edits in the code, I'm seeing it update right away in the browser page here. So now I've defined my height. I'm going to go up a little bit here, and I'm going to define the width. Now, with the width, so far we've looked at a little bit both like setting a pixel width and setting a percentage width. But I just want to go over it again. So if I set the pixel width if I set the width to 200 pixels, that is a hard number. That is 200 pixels no matter what size my window is here. However, if I start putting in a percentage, like let's say I do 25%. Now, this is 25% of the available width of the container. So we take our body, which has a margin. So inside the margin, this is now 25% of that. As I reduce the size of the page, you'll notice it changes. This is something that gets very useful once we start looking at display sizes that are different dimensions, once we start looking at making edits and updates, which we'll do in a future demo for changing how our pages display on a mobile device versus a tablet versus a laptop, these kind of things. So if I also want to do then if I've got 3 and I just want to make it a even third for each one, I can do 33%. Then this is where I go back up here and I can say position relative float left. And so now you'll see the divs start floating with each other. However, you will notice that the divs, even though it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, there's not enough room for all 3 of them to stack next to each other because the width is taking into account that extra 4 pixels all the way around of the border. So that's 4 pixels on each side. That's adding 8 pixels total to the 33%. There is a setting in CSS that allows us to set the div to take that into account, and it is called the box sizing selector. So I'm just going to copy this from here, box sizing, border box, and paste it here. And when I look back at my page, you'll see now when it figures out this 33%, it factors in the border so that all 3 of my objects can sit next to each other. Now, if I remove that, it doesn't work because the div itself is 33% plus the border. If I put it back, now it's 33% including the border. And this is extra useful when we start getting into padding. So padding goes on the inside of a div. So if I add padding, see here how the text is like right up in the corner. If you have a color, if you have a text box or if you have a div that has a color and you put text in it, you almost never want that text sitting right against the edge. You also notice it isn't evenly like in the corner. There's all this extra line height associated with it. So the letters like touching on one side, but not on the top. So typographically, that just starts to get very bothersome. And so it's very normal to start adding padding in order to nudge that away. So you do like 4, you look at 8. You can start deciding that just all happen to be factors of 4. Obviously, these can be any numbers that work. You'll also then notice that when I set my box sizing to border box, it's taking the padding into account now as well. So if I take this off, it no longer counts the padding towards the 33%, meaning that with padding, there isn't enough room for a div that is 1/3 because it's 1/3 plus the padding, which has always been a very frustrating part of CSS. But now that we have this border box, now we can add the padding here in order to properly position these 3 things with their even division. Another thing with padding is if you just use the word padding, it goes around the entire box evenly, but you can also adjust the sides, the top and the bottom independently. So you can say like padding top is 20 pixels. You see there, like bumped the top down. So you can do padding dash top, padding dash bottom, padding dash right, padding dash left, and you can then adjust those things. So let's get back to the height for a moment. You notice here that we set the height as a hard number. We just said 200 pixels. We just did that quickly in order to be able to see our divs while we were working with them. Another common option for height is auto, meaning the box will be as tall as it needs to be automatically. You see here, now that we've given it some padding, we actually see the box. And if I flip over and grab some text from what I've been working on this week, put this in the HTML, I'm going to put this in the middle div here and clean this up a little bit. So I'll add my breaks to add some new lines. We'll look at better ways to do that later with paragraph tags. I'm going to tab that in. Doesn't affect how it displays over here, but it does help this all look much, much cleaner. And then let's say this is a headline. So I'm going to go ahead and make it one. I'm going to make this my H1. You see there, starts following the H1 settings from my style sheet. And save that. Okay, so you'll see now this center div became as long as it needed to be in order to hold the content that's inside of it. That's what the height auto does. You can see here, this div, height auto, only needed to be that tall. Another very useful setting within the width and the height is using min height, meaning not only have you set the height to automatic, but you can also say what's the minimum height going to be. And sometimes this is really helpful to add just like a little bit of consistency to divs that are going to be variable. So here, if you say min height 300 pixels, the minimum height a div can be is 300 pixels, like the first one and the third one. But that middle one is going to be automatically as tall as it needs to be. It's just going to expand out to hold all the content. So that's a little bit about how we can use like the width percentage in the height and the height auto along with the padding in order to add that space inside. Another thing I want to show you is in style sheets, how you can add comments in order to like make notes to yourself. So the way that you add a comment is by using a slash asterisk and then an asterisk slash. And you'll notice that the text in here is gray. That means this is not going to be processed by the CSS, but it also means that you can type whatever you want. Because if you type something in here, just like a note to yourself that isn't CSS, it will throw an error. But in most every programming language, there's a way to add comments so that you can make notes to yourself. You can make notes to other developers. Making notes to your future self is probably one of the most useful things, but also adding in little bits so that it's easier to move around your file. So this is something that I will do periodically where I will add a comment and I just add this like dash, 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 dash pipe and then a note. And the reason for that is because then it puts my notes out here. So as my HTML and my CSS get longer and longer, I can scroll and like find like, oh, here's where the footer information is. Here's where the header information is. Here's where the page information is. By like pushing this out, into the margin like this, it becomes easier to scroll around. So that's just a little note to myself to say that like, oh, this was my week 4 additions there. Okay, I want to show you one other thing about positioning divs, which can be helpful. So we're going to go back into our week 4 index.html, and I'm going to go up to the very, very top. I'm going to make a div. This time I'm going to give it an ID of header bar. So everything we've been working with before have been classes. The benefit of classes is that you can have multiples and they will all behave the same. So these 3 divs that we made here, they are all of the class grid item. When you write a selector in CSS for grid item, it selects all of them, no problem. The idea behind an ID is that there's only one on that page. As soon as you have multiples, CSS would start to act very funny. So if I have multiple divs with the ID of header bar, the CSS and the HTML start to act really weird because it mostly just applies either to the first one or the last one, depending on what it is you're trying to do. But generally speaking, best practices, if you give something an ID, it's because you are only going to have one of them ever on that given page. So I'm going to give this div an ID of header bar, and then I'm going to put my back to home button in there, and I'm going to say like Alex Braidwood's process site, like that. Okay, so not too much has changed over here. I'm going to copy this, go back to my CSS file. Now for an ID, we start that with a number sign or a hashtag. So it's like hashtag header bar and then the squiggly brackets. So remember, a class always starts with a period. An ID always starts with the hash sign. Okay, so this is my header bar. And again, let's give it a background color. Let's choose something that we can see easily. That'll work. And might as well give it some padding right away so I can get that type away from the edge like that. Great. Now, what I want to do for this, because this is a header bar, you'll notice it's all part of the page, it's all scrolling. For this, I want to do the thing where this header bar sits in the upper left-hand corner, is the full width, and does not scroll with the page. It just hangs out at the top there. The way that I'm going to do this is first by saying position fixed. So before we were making things position relative, these divs here are position relative, meaning they're positioned relative to other things on the page. This is now position fixed, and you'll notice already it's not moving, right? It's where it should be sort of naturally based on the CSS, meaning that it's in the body, it's behaving to the margin, but it is not moving. It's just fixed. Now I want it to be in the upper left-hand corner. So to do that, I assign it left 0. These are pixels, and top 0. So the upper left-hand corner here is 0, 0. That's where we start reading. That's where the page begins rendering from. So 0, 0 is the upper left-hand corner. And you'll notice it's only the size that it needs to be. So then I am also going to say width 100% to make it the full width. And because it is position fixed, you'll see that it does not scroll with the rest of the page. However, it is going behind the elements. The reason it's going behind the elements is because it's at the top. And just the same way as we read a page from top to bottom, the HTML draws the elements to the page from top to bottom. So if you think of it as layers, think of higher up in the document, earlier in the document is lower in the layers, because it's like adding this. Then on top of that, it's adding this. On top of that is this. On top of that is this, right? So you can imagine how these would be stacked up. In CSS, instead of like bringing that all the way to the bottom, because in terms of our memory, we could do that. We could grab this, copy it here, and paste it down at the bottom, but it's at the top of our site. So putting it at the bottom of our page, but at the top of our site doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So instead, what I'm going to do is in the CSS, I will change the header bar Z index. So if I say Z index, and I'm just going to give it a really high number that's not quite 1,000, I'm going to say 999. Over here, then that should bring it to the top of the stack. So Z index meaning like the depth setting. So now I have my header bar is locked in the upper left-hand corner. It's taking up the full width. I can scroll. It stays there. It's a great way to put a nav up there and put like a bit of a header on your site. And this is just a div. You can do anything that you've been doing with divs in here. You can put links to your social media. You can bold your name. You can add images. You can do all the different things that, anything that you've been doing in a div, anything you've been doing in your HTML, you can do up here. If you've made a little, if you've made a logo for yourself, you can put all those things up there. So that is using fixed divs and positioning them exactly where you want them to be.